Imagine almost 500 years ago, when Native Americans inhabited this land. There was a special hill in which would become the state of New York that the Cayugas used as a fortification against rival tribes. This hill also represents the birthplace over 200 years ago of one of the most famous Native American chiefs in history, Chief Logan of the Cayuga Nation. This hill is now called Fort Hill Cemetery and is located in Auburn, New York. We would like you to explore and learn its rich history. Fort Hill became a cemetery before the Civil War and has since been the resting place for many famous and interesting people. Perhaps the most notable object at Fort Hill is the monument to Chief Logan. It is over 50 feet high and placed at the highest elevation of the hill. Logan was a peaceful man who resisted violence and was a friend of the white man. In 1774, all of his family, including his brother and sister, were massacred by white men. Provoked beyond endurance, Logan retaliated in bloody battles against the white man. When it came time to negotiate a treaty, Logan sent a powerful message to his opponents. The last lines of the famous speech are written at the base of Logan's monument. You will find Chief Logan's monument just up the hill from the entrance. A curious story about one of the residents at Fort Hill involves his dog. A man named Arthur Kennedy was killed in a hunting accident in August of 1897. His faithful hunting dog Sport did not leave his master's side. Sport followed the funeral procession into Fort Hill and refused to leave his master's gravesite. The caretakers of the cemetery fed the dog until his death. A special monument to Sport was placed on his master's grave. Can you guess what that might be? Ask for directions to the Willard Case plot, then look across the road and down a ways. Probably the most famous person staying at the hill is William Seward, Auburn native and Secretary of State to President Lincoln. His achievements include the purchase of Alaska and promoting the Transcontinental Railroad. He is buried between his wife and daughter in a very special place called Consecration Dell in the cemetery. Find out more about the life of William Seward at the Seward House Museum, also located in Auburn. There is one above-ground crypt at the cemetery. It is the mausoleum or tomb of the Fay family, who were a prestigious family in Auburn. The crypt contains 10 spaces for family members. One of them remains empty for Flora Fay, the wife of Fred Fay. She is said to have exclaimed that it was tough enough to spend her living days with Fred, and she was darned if she was going to spend eternity next to him. She is buried in another part of Fort Hill, along with her son. There was an orphanage in Auburn called the Cayuga Asylum for Destitute Children. It was a refuge for orphaned and abandoned children. Jane Rogers was the superintendent of the orphanage for 32 years until her death. She was a kind and caring mother figure for the children. The children that succumbed to diseases and early death were buried at Fort Hill Cemetery. Jane Rogers' grave is surrounded by the burial plots of the children she cared for. How many of the young gravestones can you count? You may have heard of the famous Battle of Little Bighorn, also named Custer's Last Stand. The Lakota and Northern Cheyenne, led by Sitting Bull, soundly defeated the U.S. cavalry led by General Custer, in which all of the soldiers were killed, including Custer. Captain Miles Keogh was one of the casualties of the battle, and his remains were brought back to Fort Hill Cemetery. Harriet Tubman, resident of Auburn and conductor on the Underground Railroad, is laid to rest beneath a large pine tree at Fort Hill. Learn more about her at the Harriet Tubman home, also in Auburn. You will see the names Willard and Case at Fort Hill. They were prominent and wealthy families that lived in a mansion in Auburn that is now the Cayuga Museum of History and Art. Theodore Case went on to invent a method of talking movies which is still in use today. You can visit the Case Research Lab in Auburn and see the birthplace of talking movies. Other residents of the cemetery include the assassin of President McKinley, Leon Saltzgauz, who was executed in the electric chair at Auburn Prison. Fort Hill was not built as a lonely, solitary place where only the dead lay. Over the years since 1852, the cemetery grounds have been used almost as a park in which residents would walk about the beautiful hills with magnificent trees. Come and explore the beauty of Fort Hill and experience its rich history.